The sense of sort of epic events unfolding on our time is once again irresistible. That story about Israel voting to ban the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating within Israel and occupied East Jerusalem, essentially cutting off the metaphorical arms and legs of any feasibility of getting aid into one of the most benighted parts of the world, is, as with the looming election in America, although the latter isn't yet a matter of life and death, almost too awful to contemplate. And we will contemplate it at some point, but not today, because it is currently at the legislative stage. And watching Netanyahu very closely over the last year, I think that they'll step back from this and try to create a sort of news manipulation in order to turn it into good news that they're not doing it and distract from whatever it is that is going on instead. So I could be wrong, but just looking at the malign genius of the communications department deployed by Benjamin Netanyahu's government, I would not be surprised if this story has a few more layers to it than current reports would allow. I hope I'm right on that. How many times do I start the show by saying I hope I'm wrong? Because if I'm wrong on that, then I'm afraid that the already hideous carnage will get immeasurably worse. Yesterday, I had a very odd show, in not least in the sense that I spent half an hour working out my own thoughts between 11 o'clock and 11:30. And that is odd. It might sometimes seem like I talk endlessly every day, but I usually get it done and dusted by 1/4 the hour ideally and 20 past at the latest. I go beyond that and we find ourselves moving into relatively unfamiliar territory. I used to do it a bit during Brexit because nobody else was telling you the truth about what was going on. But you can see the truth now, so I don't need to do that anymore. I couldn't work out why I was so reluctant to talk about the American election. It popped into my mind on Friday when we were chatting to Ray Suarez, a journalist and author in America, who bizarrely, part of the reason I was tempted to invite him onto the program, used to work for LBC in the 1980s, back in the Gough Square days of Dougie Cameron and Bob Holness presenting The Breakfast Show, and Brian Hayes being the all-time greatest presenter of this slot in the mid-morning period. But he is in America, and he, as an American chronicler of matters political, he recognized what I described. I didn't come up with the right metaphor. I said something like, the pieces on the board are so big I can't move them. It wasn't quite right. Yesterday we got closer. Yesterday there was the idea that the prospect of a fascist in the White House was so awful that we were choosing to look the other way, either to still indulge the nonsense that the evidence doesn't support the conclusion, still play semantic games and prevaricating, conflicting opinions. Oh no, he's not a fascist. Just because everything he says is fascistic doesn't mean he's actually a fascist. Just because all of his supporters say incredibly fascistic things doesn't mean that it's a fascist project. I think the key point is probably John Kelly. But of course, if you're on board with the fascism, you're still required to deny it. You're still required to deny it. And that means that you have to say the longest-serving White House chief of staff describing his former boss Donald Trump as a fascist is not to be trusted, or is to be ignored, or is not reliable. And it kind of shows you how the hierarchy works. So you start off with, let's say, Bernie Sanders, right? I don't know if he's used the word, but you start off with a doyen of the traditional left in the United States of America. And he uses the F word. And everybody joins forces to tell him he's moving too soon or he's a bit hyper. I don't know if he did. I'm just using him as an example of somebody who is the opposite, if you like, in the context of a conversation about what Donald Trump represents, the opposite to John Kelly. So, you know, a CNN, they're not really allowed to be that opinionated in the way that we are, but a liberal commentator or a former Clinton aide, somebody like that, it moves there. So it goes from the Bernie Sanders hinterland into the media space, the liberal media space, the F word gathers pace, and lots of people are putting enormous amounts of effort into pushing back. You know, Donald Trump won't be as bad as you think. Oh, look at these hysterical lefties. Look at all this hyperbole. They don't know what they're doing. So by the point it actually falls to people like his former Attorney General, Bill Barr, to detail his lies in extraordinary detail, and his former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, to acknowledge that he is a fascist. By the time you get to that space, the noise of denial and rejection and pushing back has become so loud and so commonplace that you end up allowing people, whether they realize that they're doing it or not, whether they have good intentions or not, and frankly, I doubt it. But the noise is so normal now, the noise of denial is so normal, that even when his former Attorney General and his former Chief of Staff join in the chorus of condemnation, in the case of John Kelly actually calling him a fascist, in the case of Bill Barr actually detailing the scale of the lies that he told in an attempt to steal an actual election, the noise of denial is so normal that it applies to them as well. And that's why I used the slightly unattractive phrase, the great unblocking, to describe yesterday's program, because the other problem you have is trying to make sense of it. And yesterday we did. It may have taken a little longer than normal, but we did make sense of it. And I'm afraid the unavoidable conclusion is Donald Trump remains likely to become, he has as much chance as Kamala Harris, to become the President of the United States of America, not despite being a fascist, but because he is a fascist. People like it. It's such an odd moment of realization when you think of any regime in the past that has deployed fascistic tropes. Mussolini, I suppose, most obviously. Hitler. Others in Central Europe. You had a fascist regime in Spain. I think the Greeks had a fascist military junta for a while. The people go along with it. Enough people are in favor of it to allow it to happen. I wonder whether if you could somehow have a plebiscite in Russia, a genuine plebiscite, I wonder whether there'd be a majority support there for Vladimir Putin. I suspect there might be. There probably would be, not least because he does such a good job of controlling the news. And he also, of course, has spent billions of dollars upon trying to influence the American news cycle, to the point where Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, having failed to endorse the one that isn't a fascist, has now written an op-ed for his own newspaper, for which he paid less than he pays for the average yacht that as the second richest man in the world he routinely purchases, about how America doesn't trust the news media. It's almost like their work is done. Musk and Bezos have destroyed the notion of objective truth. They have done the Orwell bit for Donald Trump, where you ignore the evidence of your own eyes and ears. Once you've done that, then anything can happen. Most obviously and most usually, fascism. So we are now at the point where you either describe it as a fascist movement or you lie to yourself and to others. And I think if he wins, thank you to Mark, who sent me a clip of Bernie Sanders describing Donald Trump as a fascist. I can't quite see it yet on my tech. I'll check it during the break, but I don't know what the date on it is. But you see my point. You start off shouting down someone like Bernie Sanders, or shouting down someone to the left of the New York Times editorial staff, or shouting down a former Clinton aide, and you end up shouting down that with the same noise and the same personnel, you end up shouting down Donald Trump's former Attorney General and Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, generals queuing up to condemn him. Reports of him saying that he wants to be like Hitler. He wants to have generals like Hitler had, generals that did whatever he demanded, regardless of the law, regardless of the Constitution, regardless of the decency, the basic morality of it all. And it's there now. Anyone who denies it is a liar. And of course, all fascists are liars, because so much of their worldview depends upon the idea that your immutable characteristics, your ethnicity, most obviously, possibly the religion you were born into, which is immutable. Just ask victims of the Holocaust. You don't get to say, I am no longer a Jew. I am no longer a Roma. It's there. That's what fascism is. So you have to tell that lie. You have to tell the lie about a sort of hierarchy of basic humanity. I saw a clip of Tucker Carlson, who remains central to Donald Trump's project at the moment, talking about using words to describe Kamala Harris as if they were de facto insults. He used the word Samoan, as if it just by dint of not being white or not being white Anglo-Saxon, you are inferior. And you can see what they feel about ethnicity and race by listening to the words that they use as insults, up to and including the bloke yesterday who described Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage. That's only one part of fascism. The other parts, of course, are impunity for your allies and persecution of your enemies, even if their crime is to have tried to uphold the law. So it's all there. It happens democratically. We read about Hitler. We read about Mussolini. We read about military juntas. We read about Franco. And we think, well, crikey, it must have been... How? You watch Star Wars. I know I'm making my dystopian pop culture references a bit too frequently at the moment. But you think, how are they going... I mean, and the answer is simple. You oppress everybody except the people that love you. And the people that love you love the stuff that repels the rest of us. So that's just true now. That's not an opinion. That's just counting. You could see the United States of America elect a fascist a week today. That's it. It could happen. So what's the phone in? What happens next? 0345 6060 973. What does it mean for the UK? Remember, we've unhitched ourselves from one of the biggest blocs in the world, one of the biggest trading and increasingly security blocs on the planet. We've unhitched ourselves from that. It's almost as if all of these things fit the same pattern, isn't it? Almost as if the people that told you leaving the European Union was going to be brilliant are the same people who are still shilling and cheerleading for Trump. It's almost as if that Venn diagram is actually a circle. But yeah, I do, actually. Karen asked a great question. Do you think he'll start saying stuff like not all fascism is bad and Hitler was great for the economy and Mussolini made the trains run on time? Of course he will. That has to be. If he wins, that has to be what happens next. Do you remember? I mean, what moment do you pick? I've got two that I think, for people who say, well, it wasn't that bad last time, you really need to give your head a wobble. There were two things that happen here, that have already happened. The first was the Muslim ban. You remember what I just said about not being able to disavow the religion of your birth? That is precisely the grounds upon which the Holocaust happened. You may never have been to a synagogue in your life, but if your matrilineal line could be proved, then you were Jewish and you were going to die. A Muslim ban, albeit that it wasn't lethal, was exactly the same in its conception. Is you might never have been near a mosque in your life, but if you're coming from a majority Muslim country, or your passport looks like it might be a bit Muslim, then you can't come into America. And he got elected on the back of that promise, remember? And then the second thing for me was Kellyanne Conway talking about alternative facts. This is what I mean when I bang on about boiling frogs. The things that you'd never allow to happen tomorrow, but which you will slowly seed in such a way that when it happens a year tomorrow, you barely notice. Alternative facts. Well, what we used to call lies, culminating, of course, in the great election fraud of 2020, when he lied and lied and lied and lied and tried to persuade other people to lie and cheat on his behalf. Those people have now become his enemies. The punishment of them is one of his stated priorities. That is fascism. That is just fascism. If you're not seeing it, it's because you're lying. Or you're not paying attention. So what happens to Britain? 0345 6060 973. What will it mean for the... No one knows the answer to this question. The fact that opportunists like Honest Bob Jenrick and others are still calling for Donald Trump to win. Failed prime ministers such as Boris Johnson and Liz Truss still calling for Donald Trump to win. I think largely because the circuit of self-enrichment that is funded by precisely the sort of people that want Donald Trump to become president because their already uncountable riches will become ever larger. And of course, the best thing you can do if you're in that category is persuade the people from whom you're taking ever-increasing sums of money that their real enemy is foreigners, their real enemy is Jews, if it's 1930s Germany, their real enemy is Muslims, if it's 21st century America, and for some people in public space here, the UK. So once the penny drops, almost everything makes sense, except this. What does it mean for the UK if they put a fascist in the White House?